We are going to go to our discussants. We're going to start with Bronwen Cowie, and then we will go to Gavin Brown. Thank you, Bronwen.
So, Morena, everyone. Bronwen Cowie Tokuinga. I'm from the University of Waikato. I had the pleasure of meeting Brent and Carrie through reading their book and thinking about their ideas. What I'm going to do is give very much an on the top of my head reflection on your talk. But I really wanted to start by acknowledging Terry Crooks. Because to me, and I suspect a lot of colleagues and people on the webinar, he was really influential in laying the groundwork for how a number of us think about classroom assessment. And I think his contribution really was as long ago as 1988 to focus attention on students and the impact of everyday, routine, often largely invisible assessment interactions on students' sense of themselves, like who they could be, what they could learn, what they could know, and what they could do. And I think that, for me at least, has been hugely influential in my thinking. It was when I was a teacher, and it has been in my research. And I just do a quick tangent and pick up on what Carrie and Brent talked about in terms of the non-verbal. And I think he alerted me, at least as well, just how important that some of those non-verbals are in terms of where the teacher stands, their body language in response to a student, even if it's just and move on. So just that the way in which students get information on their learning and what they can know and be as part of the classroom dynamic. So that's sort of a bit of background, I think, as much to locate you in New Zealand as me in this commentary that I'm going to make. So I think what I really liked and what resonated with what I think and what I think the collective we in New Zealand think was the asset model of both teachers and students. I think the asset model for both is important in that our learning theory really says we need to build on what learners know and can do. And I think it's quite important that we take that same attitude to thinking about how can we improve our teaching. So that was one point. I liked the thought that what research can offer and what teachers can offer, and this happens more strongly when we come together, is that tools that help us make sense together and make more informed decisions, and tools that do that actually provide agency. And I like the idea of the progress tool because a lot of my work has really been grounded in more interaction as part of a formative assessment process. But clearly the challenge for teachers is they can't interact with every child every lesson. And I remember when I first went in to do some research, I asked a group of students, how often would it be reasonable to get individual feedback from the teacher? I just want you to think in your head what you think they would say, but they said once a month. And I was really shocked, but then it is practical. So the idea of the progress tool I have just learnt, but I think we lack tools that will help us get nuanced individual information about each student in a way that as a teacher we can process it reasonably quickly so we can take action, if not now, but maybe the next day. And I also liked your point to remind us that maybe what we learn from this lesson we can't use now, but we're accumulating evidence of how we can help students learn over time. So we can keep that in mind going forward. I owe a big debt to Ted Glynn, who I was first able to work with looking at culturally responsive pedagogy that aimed to take better account of Māori students, both knowledge and ways of working and thinking. And the word that he taught me, which you have echoed, which I would like to foreground, is that of inviting people into dialogue. So whether that invitation is via a written means, a spoken means, or just a signal that you might like to contribute, I think that notion of inviting opens up a space for dialogue, which is very important. If I, as a student, am actually prepared to tell you I'm at the lowest level of your progress guide. Now I'm just sorry, I'm thinking what other point do I want to make? I thought the other word that you used, which was interesting, which has multiple meanings currently in the New Zealand context, was ready. What are the students ready to learn? I need to think more about the implications of that word, which in my context is quite politically loaded in terms of readiness to teach. So what does that word actually mean? I would have to say I am committed to the interplay between assessment principles and the understanding the essence of a discipline. So the interplay there, I think the progress guide probably can help with that. And I thought in your framework, that point of the learning goals at the top of the triangle is really important. Knowing where I'm sitting here with colleagues, I also have to say possibly to us as New Zealand teachers and educators that we've got the discipline or learning area knowledge, and we've got the key competencies, and increasing attention to how the different nature of knowledge is. Where does that fit into that top point of the triangle in terms of where it fits in the progress guide? And my last point really is around the triangle to do with feedback, which had dialogue, trust, and resilience on it. Dialogue and trust, I'm very familiar with. I thought resilience was an interesting and currently very loaded word. I don't have anything to say about the meaning of that word, but I just wanted to maybe collectively alert us that combination of three was quite interesting. Dialogue, yes, it should be an interactive process. Trust, yes, why should I disclose what I do and do not know without that? Resilience, an iterative journey on the part of maybe the teacher and the student. So some just off the top of the head reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwen.
Gavin, I'm going to pass to you.
Thank you, Bronwen. Good morning, everyone. I'm Gavin Brown. I'm a professor at the University of Auckland in the Faculty of Education and Social Work. I think for me, I have three question areas that I want you to tell me the answers to based on how this really works in your world. And the questions focus around teachers, students, and technology. And I'll give you the list and then you can decide which ones you can answer. It seems to me that your model requires considerable work on the part of teachers, even just to initiate the development of a mechanism and process to do a deep dive. So in that case, what kind of time and resources do teachers get to do that allows them to do that, whether it's less teaching load, smaller classes, fewer kids, fewer classes, more focused? How do you make it possible, especially in a context when eventually government and parents decide on the quality of teachers and have expectations for what teachers need to be able to do and say and achieve? And so the accountability pressure and the resource pressure, how do you make that work in your system, and what would it take to make it work in our system? In terms of students, it strikes me that the work that I've done in observing classrooms around assessment, especially with my colleague Lois Harris, who does the field work and I help her interpret it, is students are really good at faking, getting out of, avoiding, exercising autonomy to not do the things that you want them to do. They suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect of believing they're good when they're not. They suffer from the need to impression management in front of their peers to make themselves look good. So Johnny doesn't think I'm dumb when I actually don't understand. When they feel threatened, as Bronwen's work has shown, by someone looking over their shoulder and going, well, wait a minute, I'm saying something not very good. So how do you get, and then the issue of peer-to-peer psychological safety. Clearly, if you're going to have peer feedback, it requires peers to be engaged to that mutual goal of, I might not be right, but this is what I'm going to tell you. And because I might not be right, you won't get angry at me, and having that mutual commitment. And the third thing on technology, and you mentioned the future of feedback because of the pandemic forcing you to think about feedback in a different way. Well, the future has arrived. It's already here in terms of AI and ChatGPT and large language models. Where's feedback gonna go when you could just tell ChatGPT to write my feedback and who knows if it's any good? So those are my challenges and questions that I hope you have some answers to in some order.
Carrie, we don't need to jump too quick to these questions, but I can say one thing about them. We primed our good friend before we started to give us what we call softball questions in the US context, and he obviously decided to pitch hard and fast. I think there are two questions out of the three that are worth taking some time right now with, and I'll start with the first one only because I remember very well when Mike cursed on the Monday morning call back in March of this last year when we came out with this book. Mike is professor emeritus at Stanford Education School, Business School. He's worked for 40 plus years in policy. He helped to be the architect of what we call our continuous improvement accountability framework that focuses on progress rather than benchmarking through No Child Left Behind metrics. His first question was, so Brent and Carrie, how much does it cost to do what you're talking about? That was his softball pitch. I think we suffer from a little bit of the happy coincidence of teaching in pre-service programs where we have the ability to teach a course where we can form through the curriculum of teacher education a lot of these ideas and impression making and experiential learning of these concepts where you've got somebody for 15 weeks. So there's a place where you know there's low-hanging fruit. What are we doing in our teacher ed programs? What can we do to augment, support them? How can we bring some of this material into the place where students are already ready to learn to become teachers? I think the other question is the in-service piece. How do you scale up when you've got multiple school districts, multiple size buildings, multiple size classrooms in some cases? You've got special education needs and pullouts. You've got integrated classrooms. You've got the content variations between a high school and what we call an elementary school, primary, secondary. How do you scale up across all those contexts? That question is a harder one. I think one thing we could do is give ourselves back what we've lost in California, which is why we're here at your mercy. We used to have professional development days, multiple days, and some schools even put aside money to have 4 or 5 days. Now we're down to 1 or 2 a year. without professional development and support for teachers working on developing progress guides across common goals for the school, which might require half a day or a day, it's going to be very hard to have people have the opportunities to learn.
Mhm.
So I think that second piece is more complicated, and we'd like to work it out with New Zealand, because in California, we've certainly struggled to find space for that answer.
Mhm.
I'm gonna give one example
Yeah.
of concrete, helping teachers develop their first progress guide
Mhm.
and then use it with their students and then help and assisting the teachers in reflecting on the process. That happened in 4 90-minute meetings. So a
Mhm.
principal gave us teachers out of their usual faculty meeting time or other professional development time, right? Those 4 spaced out over, it was about 2 months, maybe 2.5 months. So they weren't like one, week after another. And really valuable insights and experiences by the teachers were had. So
Mhm.
4 times 90 minutes, it's doable.
And the other side of that is, again, we're not a business. So we're in Silicon Valley. I'm sure we could sell this to somebody who would tell us how to package it up and
Better.
push it faster.
Yeah.
I think what we're really interested in right now in the conversation with you all is where are the resonances where you've already got good teacher work happening, and the teachers are looking for opportunities to explore new assessment. I don't like to use the word literacies. I find that word to be, if you think about that, the opposite of literacy is illiteracy, right? So I try to think of it more as like, let's drop that. Let's just say assessment possibilities and practices, and giving teachers opportunities in a structured way with structured intervention, and maybe some online resources to say, play with the progress guides and see if they help you all have better dialogues,
Mhm.
more in-depth dialogues about student work
Yeah.
that goes back to your disciplinary knowledge. If
Mhm.
we're looking at why things sink and float, and we're really concerned that people are having trouble with facets and misconceptions around particular ideas of buoyancy in physics, we care about that and we see it a lot, and we care enough to say, let's get a group together of teachers and work on that. But let's find some new assessment modalities
Mhm.
besides either ignoring testing, which I'm okay with to a point, and then not, but also kind of just like winging it. Like, I think we have to go between winging it
Yeah.
and like, here is the curriculum
Yeah,
and here are the
yeah.
tests in the third, fourth, or first, second, third, levels. Yeah,
Yeah.
where's that space of agency, but also accountability
Mhm.
for teachers to say, I care enough about these big ideas to know how my students are doing with them. Action research here, we talked about that. Maybe this is the stance of teachers being invited into action research, where they're the ones driving some of this stuff locally as well. It's just a thought. So that was the tough first question, probably not an adequate answer. The third one I think we should take is the AI one, because that, when this book dropped in February of 2023, I don't think it was a week before I said to Carrie, this is dead on arrival. Now, that's not a way to sell a book, is it? But the point was, we needed to integrate AI. We weren't dealing with AI, but nobody was 9 months ago.
No.
Like, it's happening so fast. So can I say this? Our next book, feedback and AI.
We dive
Because-
right into the question.
Because you're probably right. If mimicry and copying and guessing and cheating are just thrown into this world
Mhm.
with generating first drafts that you actually, they're not your first drafts.
No.
Then what have you done? I mean, you've done nothing but mimicry.
Mhm.
And so I think we do really believe, like you do, about the faking effects and the kind of playing along stuff. And we also care about first drafts being generated by a machine,
Mm.
which the student has little to no agency over.
Yeah.
Even if the company sells you and tells to the students, who are very clever, you don't want to write a first draft that looks like Hemingway's second draft. You want to write a first draft that looks like a 7th grade first draft. And you can literally scale down the language model as you do in a readability, like Lexile framework, to target the kinds of language that a 7th grader would use. And the 7th grader is so savvy, they click that, that's their first draft.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're in a totally upside down world in our view as well. I think that's what you're pointing at.
Yeah.
And we have to rethink feedback in a world of, as you said, AI and large language modeling.
Thank you.
Middle question, I think we're gonna leave for next time. Carrie, did you want to take on are we good or?
Oh, students are beautiful in what they'll do.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, students, I do want to say this because it's real, and it's classroom teachers reality. And I would say that in the pilot study and the professional development where we were developing, the teachers were developing their first progress guides in those 4 90-minute sessions. It wasn't quite as neat as that, but that was basically it. Anyway, what the teachers learned and reflected on is who resisted and how, and who was right in there. And when I say who, I mean the students, what did it for, and actually to a person, the teachers expressed surprise at how deeply their students could talk about the subject content for the length of time that they did. So it actually turned out that they had lower expectations for their students than their students demonstrated with the progress guides. So these, when I say, you know, be open and honest, or be open to the honest things that you can learn about your class, you can learn some painful things, but what a beautiful thing, but also painful, right? Because they did learn, they didn't think their students could talk that long about math or science, which is what the group was.
And you just reminded me, Carrie, because you found this is what you discovered in your observation in the video. We've got a lot of this recorded. You don't actually have to have the progress guide as like a checklist. Okay, I've got to do the progress guide. No. We saw teachers approach proximally and say, well, how are you doing with the progress guide? Where do you think you are? And then realize the student wasn't ready to look at the progress guide. Move the progress guide to the side, did the conversation, the dialogic piece, and then came back to, well, so do you think that means that we might start here? So it wasn't that you turn it into another checklist. The other reason why we went for the progress guide versus the traditional self-assessment approach we hear a lot about, which is thumbs up, thumbs down.
Red light, green light.
Yeah.
You want to talk about what you raised in your second question? I mean, that's the stuff that we worry about that's not tied to a curriculum at all, or even tied to the content that you're studying, right? So at least with the progress guide, you've got the word evidence there, or you've got some other language. You're pointing back to something that is tied into what you would consider to be the authentic learning. So we don't want to disconnect feedback signals from the actual learning activity, but we don't want to tie it into fill out the checklist. So it's somewhere in between that
It
space.
needs to be flexible, and
Yeah.
I have experienced or heard that New Zealanders and New Zealander teachers like need to respect flexibility.
Yes,
So,
that's what we've been hearing. So thank you, teachers, by the way, who joined us and are joining us today. We've had our discussants give us some very thoughtful and important probes. We got them earlier too, so we're doing our best to keep up. But can we now offer it back to the whole group and answer some questions if possible?
Yep, that's a great opportunity because there's a few people that have been asking some questions, so we'll choose a couple of them for the time that's
Sounds good.
remaining. So first of all, from Catherine, when I give feedback, I try to give it in a way that makes my students think like a writer or a mathematician, a scientist, etc. Is there any research that backs this up as a good strategy?
It's funny, that's Catherine. Catherine, so when I was teaching in New York City, that's exactly how we framed feedback without knowing it was feedback or even knowing the literature. We said, we're working today as historians. And as historians, we approach things in terms of a kind of, we don't take everything at surface value. We don't just read things off the way they appear. We try to probe a little bit and we try to go underneath. And the historian's job is, so that would go to, I think, Catherine's point. Yes, you're learning a disciplinary practice, particularly in high school and secondary. You're aiming to college and picking a major. Hopefully you're going to become a historian or a scientist or a pharmacist or whoever you're going to become. And so I think it's critical that we do the modeling for the student, that the work of feedback is the work of the profession that we're in. Scientists take peer-reviewed papers. They don't take the first draft. They don't accept, ignore comments. They'll never be published. So that's one way to see it, the role. In terms of research to back up the effectiveness of those strategies with what we would consider to be outcomes, I don't know about that. But I'm less worried about that than I am about the insight that Catherine's given us, which is let's model feedback as a professional disciplinary goal for people growing into something, particularly again in the middle to high school years, less so probably in the primary, although it could happen there too.
And Catherine, I would just commend you on your practice and say that the research that my mind gravitates toward about this specifically shows that it's rarely done.
So you may be onto
So
something.
you are dynamite to be doing it that way.
Fantastic. Catherine's made a comment, but you might like to reflect on it. I've discovered that giving only the appropriate feedback to the stage of the process is important. For example, there's no point in indicating spelling mistakes if they're still developing characters or setting in a piece of creative writing. At the same time, I can't keep on giving feedback again and again. I just don't have time.
Well, we've said neither can we. We're teachers and professors, so we know what it's like to have to close the loop, and we know what it's like to have to move on. I think my initial impression of that is there's only a certain number of iterations we can agree to, and then there is that drop deadline. And whether that's in a unit or whether it's a midterm or whether that's a final, however we parse our assignments through our weeks. I think the key aspect of that is, no, you can't keep giving out feedback, and you have to also be strategic. You may want to, again, out of your whole syllabus, your whole plan for your year, your whole plan for your semester, again, pick those signature assignments that you think are the places where you could give more feedback than you would have on every other part of your practice. So I guess I feel like less is more.
Less is more, yeah, and this coming to peace as a teacher with two things. One is that you can't do it all or give, even if you personally have an inclination upon seeing, errors, you want to give that kind of feedback. So it's coming to peace with that and being purposeful and strategic. So I encourage you to think of it as stepping into a river and letting go in some way. It sounds like you're recognizing that we know we can't do it all, but making peace with just how strategic we do have to be, and less is more, as Brent said.
Now, here's the other thing, and this is what I found a little bit cynical about some of the self-assessment push that's coming out of the States. You start to wonder if the self-assessment push is really about offloading teachers' feedback so that students will do more busy work. We don't need students doing busy work when they're not competent or even engaged to get feedback. What we really want is genuine exchanges of feedback. So we do have to monitor. But maybe one thing we could do is say, in addition to having a few signature assignments in which we drive the feedback cycle, we also then pick 2 places in the semester where they're gonna drive it, the kids, and we're just gonna be guides on the side, edging and pushing, but we are gonna take their feedback seriously enough to say, they are doing some work, it's labor time, they're putting it in, and they will be rewarded for that work. That will be a considered part of their participation or their engagement or something that we value in the classroom. So we might give them incentives to be involved, but we don't want to be in the business of offloading and pretending that every student, just by filling out a form, has learned something. So we have to get back to, we moderate, we're guides on the side, we may do it ourselves on the lab, we may be writing those notes or giving those comments, but there might be other assignments where we have students doing that, and we're there to make sure that it goes in the right direction.
Possibly.
Please.
I'd quite like you to elaborate a bit more on the role of peers in response.
Well, that's
to that.
your area of
You sort of
expertise.
touched on that
Yeah.
because that sort of potential for mutual learning, if it's well scaffolded.
Yeah, I'm a proponent for students self-assessing before they engage
Totally
in peer
agree.
to peer.
Okay, good, we got
That's
that
like
answer.
one rule of thumb. Like, that's the-
Yes.
So what I guess I thought, you really know about that, Dr. Cowie, that this is your area. I think our intuition about it and some of the research and experience with it was exactly what Carrie said. We do see, people ask us, what goes first with the progress guide? Teacher uses it, student uses it, and I think there is a bit of the art of finesse. A student might need to self-assess to get the temperature read and the comfort with, I'm on task. I mean, I think again, because we were all such good students, why would we not be here? We're all teachers, we love learning. But we care a lot about students who don't love learning. We care a lot about students who don't know where the task is, who come into class a little bit uncertain about what we did yesterday because they weren't here yesterday. So we have to iterate again and again. Yes, peer, self, these are all ways to get at, so how are we going? I think that's how the Australians say it. How are we going?
Yeah.
Like that's pretty much it over and over again. How are we going with different tools?
I mean, it's clear students can, peer-to-peer feedback can be shared endarkenment and collaboration, that there's actually no substantive truth or knowledge or
Right.
wisdom or insight.
Yeah.
And putting the better students with the weaker students for peer feedback, often perceived by the better students as, well, why are you making me do the teacher's job? And how is this gonna help me if I have to explain it to this whatever kid?
Yeah.
And so it's a very delicate art of working out a deal in the environment that we do this because it will help you learn, it'll help them learn, and you might get it wrong and they might get upset, but we're not gonna get upset and all that psychological safety issues. But it seems to me that the real is that the touchstone has to be, we're in this game to be realistic about what I know, what I don't know, what you know, and congratulate you on, wow, you really got that, rather than resent you for being smarter than me. And that's hard to learn.
Well, and again, vice versa, it's all about what side of the hourglass you're on, or maybe even what part of the table you've been invited to or never been invited to.
Mhm.
I'm very, very aware that I've always been invited to the table. I'm very, very aware of my privilege. I'm very, very aware of the way in which my family emphasized education and made sure that I was always talking at the table. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? It's pretty silly and I think kind of morally suspect to assume that everyone had that privilege. It's much better to say, what are ways of talking that I didn't have at my table, but you did, and tell me how that went. It's about building a cross-cultural, multicultural, collaborative learning space, and I'm gonna use the D word, John Dewey.
Okay.
You know, who reads John Dewey anymore? Nobody. John Dewey did sort of think of schools as one thing, the place we learn democratic habits, the place we learn what citizenry is, the place we learn how to be together in a classroom on a project where I feel like you're shirking and I'm not getting enough credit for what I do.
Mhm.
Is that any different in the workplace? Is that any different in the political space? Children will become adults and they will go into the same roles and routines. So can we begin to bend that narrative and that experience early, where we really respect, not just blathering, but I just didn't know that that's how you all did it, or that's how you did it, you experienced it. It's an encounter.
One of my notes prior to coming was that issue about different cultural
Mhm.
orientations towards feedback, and actually different orientations towards the meaning of silence, because in the feedback we tend to focus a lot on what I'm doing now, which is talking or writing or something, but just the power of silence as a feedback and the nuances of that in different cultural spaces.
It's huge.
In our first book on Mastering Informative Assessment Moves, we had a chapter, a move called pausing. And pausing is about silence, and we wrote about that. And it's very hard to give silence. You wrote an article at Phi Delta Kappa with a colleague about something about like milliseconds of time between words.
Yeah, milliseconds of time, yes, and a lot of it had to do with, yeah, basically that we don't drop the habits of conversation outside the classroom the moment we cross the threshold into our classroom, whether that we as a teacher or students in the same way. And so you're used to, tend to be, rapid fire turn taking. And yet, when you're a teacher addressing 30 students in a room, to be fair to students who process a bit slower, you need to create a silence that's longer than a second, and just how painful and unusual it is. And I use the word painful, purposefully, because teachers do, especially beginning teachers whom I work with, experience it as painful. And just some of the implications, or that, just in answering, people answer yes much quicker than they answer no. In a lot of cultures across the board. Yeah, so what that means to a classroom.
So feedback has to be interwoven with basic moves around respect, pausing, creating spaces where a student could say, I'm not ready to take this feedback. This is not a good day for me. And again, you think about, I just came out of my, missing the bus, and I have a placement where I'm not like all the rest of your kids. I'm a foster youth. Did you know that? And maybe I have needs that require me to process not cognitively differently, but respecting my situation outside of the classroom and how I got here and how I'm gonna leave it. that stuff matters for teaching and learning. So all this good talk about feedback, formative assessment, the child, the person's at the center of all of it.
It does, and it has tentacles into other areas, right? Right, students,
Yeah,
it's not
lives.
just about feedback, yeah, students' lives, our lives. Yeah, and I'm a proponent, again, I say the word proponent quite a bit this webinar, but I'm a proponent for, as classroom teachers, pushing into an uncomfortable zone of naming things. Like, I didn't grow up talking about how my family was talking with one another. And yet, as a classroom teacher, I must talk with a group of 4 students about how I notice them talking with one another, or how we as a whole class want to interact with one another. Because priming for these inevitable uncomfortablenesses, right? When we can name it and talk about it, I think that can help what happens in the classroom.
Before we go, Bronwen's work was what brought us to New Zealand. We read your articles from the late 1990s and early 2000s, and you talked about noticing. You talked about teachers becoming reflective around a lot of things with their students and really starting to see the curriculum through their students. And I think that was completely resonated with us about, the student first, but encountering the student means not pretending by being polite with this, that, or the other. It means really engaging. And sometimes that means pausing and listening and taking a break. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I think we do. We have still about, I think we'll have to pick one, so I'll do that. Sorry for the people that are missing out, but this is one I think that gets right back to one of the things you've introduced, the whole idea of a progress guide. So Christina's asking, do you already, or do you have any results of how the progress guides can support students across years? For instance, do students continue with the practice of reflecting on their work and giving feedback without the explicit use of a progress guide? Do they make the practice part of their learning, or do they need continual nudges that nudge? So I think that'd be a good one to.
We haven't done a longitudinal study yet to have that, Christina, yet, yeah. But it would be fantastic. I think the potential is there. We just need to make it work with meeting the teachers.
Yeah, and I think underneath that question is a really good idea about, do progress guides travel with the student from 6th, 7th, 8th? Do they grow with them? Or do they become a one-off experience in one classroom or one grade level and they never see a progress guide again? That's the challenge of all reforms. I mean, that's true even with rubrics. That's true with any graphic organizer. How much does it really get embedded in school culture? How much is it transferred to the culture from year to year, from subject to subject? But I also think what I like in that question, if I heard it right, Christina, was it's kind of like the notion of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, where you reach a place of automaticity. You reach a place where you no longer need the visualization of the progress guide, because it's like training wheels on a bike. The training wheels can go. Now you're magically riding your bike and you don't know how you figured it out, but you're doing it and you forgot that you were on training wheels for a good portion of your time. Maybe progress guides can be thought of developmentally that way, that they are explicit, but they can be removed as scaffolds over time. Because again, what are they? They're nothing more than schematic representations of, well, I'm not yet at this place. And what does that place look like? Oh, there's a place that far ahead? It's some way of visualizing that sense of growth and progress.
I guess learners understanding that they can construct them for themselves, or in collaboration with their teachers, is a really important skill as they get older too.
And to put a counter view, I suspect that because disciplinary knowledge diverges as you progress through, and because more and more sophisticated and complex knowledge is introduced through time, that the progress guide may need to be different and may need to be reintroduced to deal with the nature of the new material. So it's we don't know yet.
That's hardly a counter. I think that's an augmentation. That's saying that really the progress guide, again, is a social tool to engage us in thinking through what we consider to be more sophisticated performances, more complex ideas. And yes, you may need to be putting them in place as new disciplinary knowledge evolves as well, because knowledge is not static. We all know that. The chemistry curriculum that I took is not the one they're taking today. The physics curriculum today is different than the one in the past. So possibilities.
So I mean, is the point then something like the meta progress guide? Some understanding of how you know
You know,
what are the elements of progress somehow, and do they vary across disciplines?
That's nice.
if I can offer one personal anecdote, grade 12 history, I did the first assignment of the year, which by doing what I always did before the internet, you copied, paraphrased from an encyclopedia, handed in, Mr. Lemon wrote, C, so what, question mark. That's all he wrote. That's the only feedback he gave. And that has been the meta feedback that has guided my intellectual curiosity and drive ever since.
It was strategic and purposeful, and it didn't take him that much time.
No.
And that was exactly what was on that wall on 106 and Madison Avenue in my classroom, and the question was relevance, and what was the question underneath? So what? So here we have again, this amazing experience of coming from different cultures, different institutional backgrounds, different schoolings. And yet we find ourselves still coming back to the enduring questions, right? And so if progress guides can be meta, even around those enduring questions, that would be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Right. Hey, fantastic. Look, it's my job to say a massive thank you to our guests. Thank you, Gavin, Brent, Carrie, and Bronwen. Wonderful that you've taken this time out. And thank you too for everybody that's attended. It's a big thing in the holidays to step back into the mode of thinking about what we do all year long when we work so hard. And we really appreciate that you've taken this time. This will be recorded and the link will be made available. But we hope that you have a wonderful day, and yeah, all the best for the rest of the week.
Kia ora.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora.